Some of the commands you've been using so far have a little bit of automation behind them known as generators. And generators you can think of like templates. They essentially create the spec or the specification to apply to the Kubernetes cluster based on your command line options. So when you think of commands like run and expose and create, they often will have generators behind them that give the template necessary with all the fields and the defaults that you're not necessarily specifying at the command line. Essentially, the point of these generators is to make it easier for you to use one-line commands, like you've been used to with Docker and Docker Compose and Swarm, to use those one-line commands in Kubernetes while leaving some of the more advanced settings up to defaults. And really, Swarm does this too. Swarm has a lot of defaults when you create services and stacks that are all happening in the background. You just don't know it. So these generators are like that. So here an example where we're creating a deployment with the create command, and we're giving it a couple of options to meet the minimum requirements, and it will fill in the rest of the specification with a generator. Now these generators are different for each type of thing you're creating, whether it's a service or a deployment or a job or a cron job, other stuff we'll talk about later. And those generators can actually change over time as each version of Kubernetes comes out. They might change one or two properties of that specification. And so these have versions. Sometimes if you've seen in documentation, you might see some YAML for Kubernetes and it says something about beta. Well, that's often when a generator is first created. It might have a beta version, and then as it graduates to a mature generator, it'll have a V1. Now, we can't really get a list of generators at the command line because it spans different commands and different options, what generators might get used. So the easiest way here throughout all these different commands to see what would be generated if you typed that command against a cluster is to use two options. The dry run, which is a really neat way to show the output of what you typed, and we'll see that in a second. And then the -o, which means output, and we're saying we want an output in YAML. So we're essentially saying run this command, but don't technically do it on the cluster. Just try it out to see what would happen if I did it. And then at the same time, show me the YAML output of what would be generated if I finish this command. And you'll get nice little templates essentially. And you can even use that to start creating your own YAML that we'll use in later lectures. And finally, generators here, you might also consider them opinionated defaults. They really aren't opinionated. They're super small. They're usually 10 to 15 lines of YAML, just the bare minimum to get a thing started. So they do have opinions though, which is why they're having versions. You might see a beta version graduate and whatnot. So I do consider them opinionated, but they're fine, right? They're going to work for most use cases when you're just trying things out for dev and test. So let's go through a couple of examples to see these generators at the command line. The first one here is a deployment like we've used before, the create deployment. And you'll notice that I put the -- dry run at the end. And if you just do a dry run, it will only spit out the type of resource it would create. So this is similar to the name of the resource we see when we list it out with a kubectl git command. But if I hit the up arrow there and type -o YAML on the end, it will then show me the YAML output that it generated with that command. And we're going to go through YAML specifications later, but for now, you can see the major parts of what was done in the background when we did that create deployment command. First, it shows the API version, the version of this type of resource. So we're using a apps/v1 version here. The kind is the deployment, and that's because we're creating a deployment. If it was a job, it would show job. If it was a service, it would say service, that kind of thing. The metadata is always going to be there for any resource you create. It will have the timestamp, which is optional because it will generate that automatically when you really create this thing. And then you're going to have labels and then a name attribute here that you can specify. In this case, you're seeing that it's filled a lot of this in with what I gave it at the command line. I told it I wanted to call it test. So it's giving it a name of test. It's assigning it an app. Since we're using a deployment here, it considers it an app, not a service or something else. And it's calling that label test. These are just defaults out of the box. And then the spec for the deployment is replicas of one. The selector we'll get into later, but that's essentially how this thing determines to select the pods inside this deployment. It's basically what matches the deployment to its pods. Then strategy, which we leave blank. The template here is for the replica set, and then you'll see under that spec the containers that it will create. So there's a little bit of a nested layer of spec thing going on here, and that's due to the complexity of these layers, right? We have pods, then replica sets, and then deployments on top of that. So you can see that it's creating all that on the fly, and we'll apply that to the API when we hit this command. Let's create a few more here. The second one is using jobs instead of deployments. So it's usually designed when you want to create a set of pods that will run once. So it tends to set them with a default to not restart. And in this case, we're going to use the same image, the same name. We're going to dry run it with the -output YAML, and you'll see that how much different it is. In this case, since we don't have the multiple levels of a deployment with replica set nested inside it, we don't need the multiple levels of spec. And you'll see first off that this one's much shorter, and that's largely due to the fact that with deployments, it creates a nested replica set, which then creates the pod. So there's multiple levels there, where here we really just have this batch job creating pods directly for us. So you can see up at the top that the API version and the kind have both changed. The metadata is very similar, although in this case it didn't create an app label. And the spec is just for the jobs, and then below it, the spec inside it, inside that template, is the spec for each container pod, right? So this one spec would be created for however many I asked it to create. We only created one by default, so it's going to have one container running Nginx with the name test. And you'll notice that the restart policy is never, and that's the change really with most of these other ways of creating containers in Kubernetes. They will automatically try to recreate or restart. And with a job or later with a cron job, you'll see that the restart policy is set to never, because typically once a job finishes, it's just done and you don't want that container recreated. And lastly, let's do an expose command. Now, even though there's a dry run here, when you run expose deployment, it's going to check for that deployment and realize that it doesn't exist, so it can't give you the sample output because it doesn't really have the valid input. So in this case, we technically need to create a deployment. And in this one, we don't need it to be dry run and output. We just want it to create it. So let's just do that. And then let's go back up to that expose command and try it again. And then that dry run will work this time. So we'll have an API version of v1. And you'll notice that the service is the kind now instead of deployment or job. And then we've got other similar labels. You'll see that the spec is all about ports and protocols, because that's really what a service is it's the combination of network routes and IP subnetting and TCP or UDP ports and stuff like that. So generators aren't necessarily a huge deal. You don't need to memorize them or learn the differences between all of them, because as you'll find, a lot of them with the kubectl run command are going away, as you'll find out in a minute. And then in a later lecture, we'll talk more about the types of ways you create containers and maybe why you won't be using a whole lot of run and creates in your production workloads. And remember to delete the test deployment if you created it for our last command where we tested the expose. Based on when you watch this video, there's going to be a slight different expectation of how to use the run command. And so starting in the version 1.12 and then at least through the current versions of release 1.15 and possibly in the next few, there's going to be different messages based on how you use or operate the run command. And so its state and its uses has changed over the years. And so the goal now with the run command is to reduce its functionality and deprecate many of the generators that you just previously learned about, deprecate most of those, in fact, all of them but one, and leave it as a single run command that's designed to just start a pod. One of the goals here is to reduce its complexity so that it's very similar in experience to the Docker run command, only you're running it on top of Kubernetes. And we want to get rid of the generators that use deployments and all these other types of generators, because they're now available in the kubectl create command. So when you think about in the future creating objects from the one-liner command lines, think of the create, and then the run is really just going to be left to doing pods. And the single use really that I have for running pods really quickly is when I just want to get something started. Maybe I'm on a machine that doesn't have Docker because I'm using Containerd or Cryo or one of the other runtime engines, and I don't have Docker run convenience for me, but I do have Kubernetes installed, so I can do a kubectl run, which gives me a similar experience. For me, the real reason and only use case for me to use run nowadays, now that we have this deprecated stuff on a day-to-day basis, is for running one-shot containers, like troubleshooting or network testing or something like that. Or I just need to jump into a container network and I need to have a command line there for some reason. That's when I use a run. But it's kind of important still, at least for the next few years, to understand the history of run, because you're going to find all sorts of examples, including in these videos that I'm giving you, on using the run command, because it's had a lot of history with Kubernetes. And so when you're seeing examples, you might have to translate on blogs or different documentation that's going to be outdated in a few years. You're going to see that stuff and you're going to have to translate, okay, I used to do that with the run command. Now I've got to do that with a create command. So let me give you some examples of how the run command used to work and still, frankly, does today in the version you're using to do this course. Because when this stops working, I'm going to take this video out and replace it with a sort of in memory of the run command. Let's talk about this thing we have that we no longer have anymore. So let's look at a few commands. I'm just going to throw them in at the command line so that you see what generators they were using based on the type of run command you were using. And this is part of the confusion with run, is it started to get really complex in its use cases because of various things you would do with the command line would change the way it behaved when it created your resources. So with all of these, I'm just going to do a dry run to show you what the object that was created was. And so for this command, this is the standard one. You learned how to create deployments earlier, and you'll notice that this default, I'm not specifying a generator here, which I can do with the -- generator, but I'm not going to use that because I want to show you how the run command changes over time. So without the generator today, it's going to give you a deployment. In the future, when they finally make this change, the default run will create a pod, not a deployment, and it'll be expected that you use create or apply to create deployments, those commands, and leave the run only for the pods. So today, this is on 114, and you'll see that it creates a deployment right there named test. And for these next few, you've not seen me give you these examples because I didn't want you learning all the different nuances of the run command if you weren't going to be using them in a few years. So here, you would see in this one, I added a port and expose there, which in this case, it will give me the warning like normal, and it will then create two different things. It'll create the deployment and the service resources without having to use two different commands. So it was a really handy way to create and expose a deployment. But again, that's going away because you can use the expose or the create commands separately, and it turns out that the automation and complexity of this may not be a good idea going forward. So they're going to get rid of that. The next one here, I took out the expose part, and then I added a restart on failure. And this will create a different type of resource. It'll create the batch job or just the job type. And that one there is essentially for one-shot containers, things that you need to run. Maybe you need to do a schema update on your database, or maybe you want to do a quick database backup, and you only want it to recreate the container if it failed. So those were things you could do with run, but you can also now do those with other ways. The next one here is I set restart to never instead of on failure, and that will then change the resource type to a pod, which will soon be the default. So this is a little confusing. You can force this behavior, and you'll notice if we go back to one of these previous commands, like I just showed you, when I do the restart on failure, the reason that line is there is it's saying in the future, this is what's going to happen by default. If you don't want that to happen, you can either force a different generator like I'm doing here, which is using the job v1, or use the create command, which they would prefer you use. So my course is designed for that future use. I'm not teaching you all the different ways to run the run command. I'm just going to focus on the create and other options like apply. And then the last one here, in case you just didn't know this existed, because we have cron job support in Kubernetes, if I gave the same run command, but then I gave it a schedule, it would change the generator to use a cron job, which a little bit different than a job. The cron job is designed to be reoccurring. So it will happen, in this case, it's once a day. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the history of the run command. Again, I think really the future for us, we should just start behaving as if it's only creating pods, because here soon, whether it's going to be in possibly 116 or 117, I'm not sure when they're going to force the real change. All of these will be pulled out at some point and won't even be able to use these generators, and will be forced to use create and apply and other ways to create the different types of resources.